Come join Melissa and her guests on the Chats from the Blog Cabin podcast. From North Carolina, this podcast will have you feeling like you've known these folks for years. Listen in as they chat about life, culture, current events, and more, all with a special Southern flair. Curl up with your favorite beverage and get ready to be entertained. Tune in now for a unique experience that's fun and insightful.
Hey guys, before we begin today's episode, I want to ask you one question. Who is the strongest woman you've ever known? The one whose story deserves to be remembered. Who is it? Think about it. Who would that person be? For me, that woman is my paternal grandmother. She was a single mom of 8 children, a survivor of domestic abuse, and a woman who endured the heartbreaking loss of 2 of her babies before they turned 2 years old. Later in her life, she became legally blind, yet she refused to let that define her. She lived independently, she cared for the elderly, and she left a legacy that shaped generations, including inspiring my dad's lifelong work with the Lions Club, helping the blind. Today, I want to tell you the story of a woman whose strength didn't make headlines, but whose courage changed our family forever. And her name was Hazel Ruth Miriam Greene. Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Chats from the Blog Cabin. I'm your host, Melissa, and today's episode is deeply personal. Instead of interviewing a guest, I want to tell you about a woman whose strength shaped generations in my family. And that's my grandma Greene, Hazel Ruth Miriam Greene. Originally, her name was supposed to be Hazel Ruth, but like you heard in my story about my sister Karen, my grandmother actually when I talked about Maddie and we added Karen's name to Maddie's name, that's the same exact thing that happened to my grandmother, is that she had an aunt that passed away and they added her name into her name. So Miriam is where it's from. Her story is not one that you'll find in the history books, but it's one of courage, resilience, faith, and quiet determination. And I believe stories like hers matter just as much, if not more, because they remind us that ordinary women are often live the most extraordinary lives. And they're often the ones that touch our hearts the most. So my grandma Greene was a single mother of 8 children, which is alone as a sacrifice. But her story was even harder than that. She was a domestic abuse survivor at a time when women really rarely spoke about it and had very few places to turn for help. Leaving wasn't easy, and survival required a courage that many people today might not fully understand. And the story goes that my grandmother got back with her husband long enough for them to make a baby, then he would beat her, and then she would leave, and then she'd go back to him, and then he would beat her, and she would leave, and she would go back to him, and then beat her, and leave, and go back. 8 times. I think my mom said a period of 10 to 15 years. I think it was 10 years. This is my dad's mom. That maybe she had a period twice in the whole 10 years because the babies were right after each other. And my dad was the oldest of 8 kids. So my grandmother was a single mom of 8 children, which alone is a life of sacrifice and strength. You know, she didn't really talk about losing those 2 kids, those 2 boys, Richard and Daryl. I remember their names, and I know exactly where they're buried at in Massachusetts because they're buried with my great-grandmother's 2 kids that she lost because they had 4, but they lost 2, and they had ended up having 2 girls. Grief changes a person. It leaves marks on our hearts that never fully fade. Yet somehow she kept going because she still had children who needed their mother. At one point, life became so difficult and my grandmother had to do something incredibly humbling. She returned home to her parents. She moved back with them so she and her children could survive and rebuild their lives. And I will say, honestly, that was probably the best thing that she could have done because the impact that my great-grandfather had on my dad was enormous. I mean, that's who my dad considered his dad. My dad, the oldest of her children, experienced those years firsthand. It takes strength to fight through hardship, but it also takes strength to admit you need help. It takes strength to admit that you're wrong. It takes strength to take your part of the fault, but not all the fault. So my grandmother did what most mothers do. She swallowed her pride and chose what was best for her children. So eventually, as her children grew older, and my dad was, like I said, was the oldest. She had 2 sons join the military. Most of them have lived and had very long marriages. None of them are alive now. None of the children are alive. My Uncle Billy was the very last one to die, but my dad was the second to last. So my grandmother's journey didn't suddenly become easy because her kids grew up and went out of the house. Because later in life, she became legally blind. For many people, that kind of diagnosis could have become defining. It could limit their independence and reshape their identity. But not Grandma Greene. We used to have a saying in our house: telegraph, telephone, tell Hazel. Because if you didn't want a secret to be let out, you wouldn't tell her, because she would tell everything. She lived on her own, refusing to let blindness determine the boundaries of her life. And she adapted. She persisted. She continued living with dignity and independence because that's who she was. So when her children were grown, and before she got the diagnosis of being legally blind, she did something that was perfectly reflected in her character. She became a caregiver to the elderly. After raising the 6 kids to adulthood and surviving unimaginable hardships, she still chose a life centered on caring for others. Even as a child, I remember her heart for people. Whenever my parents had to travel or be away, she would always come stay with us. She showed up. She helped. She loved quietly in practical ways. And love, those are the kind of memories that stay with you. And I will say that we have so many jokes about her. Like, she was not the best cook in the world. And like, literally, she could even ruin spaghetti. I mean, I can still remember, and that's where I learned that if you throw spaghetti against the wall and it sticks, it's done. And so I remember that, but she couldn't even boil water because she was a horrible cook. But I also remember a conversation where we had a dachshund when we were growing up, and she would always say that the dachshund's name was Poochie. I don't know where the name came from, but my sister Karen loved that dog. And so every time my grandmother would come, she would say, "I'm taking Poochie with me." And literally, even if Poochie was standing right next to Karen, Karen still made my grandmother open up her suitcases to make sure Poochie was in the suitcase with her. So I really thought that was really funny. So, like she said, she showed up, she helped, she loved quietly in practical ways. And there was a period of time when she actually moved to North Carolina and took care of an elderly woman in North Carolina. I think her name was Miss Mills. And we got to see her a lot. Not to say that I didn't love my grandma Dresser, which is my mom's mom, but she was more a prim and proper grandma, where my Grandma Greene was more like, you could be a kid with her. You could have fun with her. She loved to read. She was the best. I mean, I love both my grandmothers, but her death hit me harder because she was just so full of life, and she didn't worry about what other people thought. So one of the most meaningful parts of her story is how her blindness influenced the next generation. Watching his mother navigate life with vision loss had a profound impact on my dad. It inspired him to become deeply involved in the Lions Club, an organization well known for its work supporting people with vision impairment and blindness, to the point that he literally gave tons of money to the Lions Club. He became involved with them. He rose to the Lions Club in each state have a district. And so he rose to the governor of the district that he was in. He always went to Camp Dogwood, which is in North Carolina, where he would go and he would spend volunteer hours going through eyeglasses and making sure the camp was better for the vision impaired so they could go to camp. They also had a VIP fishing tournament and the Outer Banks that he would always go and help and be part of. It just gave him so much joy to help and give back to people like she did. And so I think that's very important to notice too, is that he also became a caregiver and gave back. So in many ways, my grandmother's challenge became a catalyst for service. Her life influenced not just her children, but the people my father would go on to help throughout that work. That's how legacy works. Sometimes the ripple effects of one life reach far beyond what we will ever see. And I think that's important to know, because that is why I'm doing some of the episodes solo tributes, because I feel like we need to pay tribute to the ordinary, extraordinary people in our life. They may not have a lot of books written about them. May not have written a book. They may not have been on TV. They may have not had a lot of stuff written about them, but they still showed up and they still cared. So when I think about my grandmother, I don't think about the hardships first. I think about her strength, a woman who survived abuse, a mother who endured unimaginable loss. I mean, I can't even imagine losing my kids. A parent who humbled herself to protect her children. A woman who refused to let blindness define her independence. And someone who spent her life caring for others. She didn't live a famous life, but she lived a faithful one. And sometimes that kind of quiet courage is the most powerful legacy of all. If you have a woman in your life whose story deserves to be remembered, whether it's a grandmother, a mother, a teacher, a friend, I encourage you to tell that story, because stories keep legacies alive. Thank you for listening today. Until next time, remember, the women who shaped our lives are often the ones whose strength was forged in the quietest moments, and their stories deserve to be told. Before we end today's episode, I want to say something I wish I could have said to my grandmother one more time. Dear Grandma Greene, your life wasn't easy. You carried burdens that many people never saw. You survived abuse. You endured the heartbreak of losing 2 of your babies. You raised 6 children and fought for them every single solitary day. And even when life forced you to humble yourself and return home to your parents just to survive, you did what most mothers do. You chose your children over your pride. Later in life, when blindness entered your world, you refused to let it define you. You kept living, and you kept living, and you still managed to get in everybody else's business. You kept caring for others. You kept showing us what strength really looks like. I remember you coming to stay with us when my parents were away. I remember the quiet ways you loved and served our family. And at the time, I didn't think I realized how extraordinary you were, but I see it now. Your life shaped our family in ways that are still unfolding. Your story even inspired my dad to serve others through the Lions Club and help people facing vision loss. Grandma, your life mattered, not because the world celebrated you, but because you showed us what perseverance, humility, and love truly looked like. And today, your story is still being told. Your legacy lives on in your children, in your grandchildren, in your great-grandchildren, and the generations still to come. Thank you for your strength. Thank you for your sacrifice. And thank you for the example you left behind. Love always. And most importantly, thank you for giving birth to the amazing man that was my dad. And showing him that love is greater than any other emotion. Love your granddaughter. So today's story reminded you of a woman whose strength shaped your life. Take time to tell her story, because the woman who came before us deserved to be remembered. And sometimes the most powerful legacies are the ones built quietly, one small act of courage at a time. Reach out to someone before it's too late. Until next time, guys. Bye.